600,000 soldiers were about to march on her city. She had no army, no weapons, no political power. The only thing she had was a window and a piece of red cord. By the time the sun rose, the woman everyone in Jericho dismissed would be the only reason anyone in her family was still breathing. This is the story of Rahab, but not the version you've heard in Sunday school. We're not here to just retell what happened at Jericho. We're here to ask the question almost nobody asks: why her? Out of an entire city, why does the Bible hand its survival to a woman society had already thrown away? That's not an accident of storytelling. That's the entire point. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The story should have centered Joshua. Instead, scripture pauses the war to spend an entire chapter inside the house of a sex worker. That structural choice is the thesis of this video. Jericho sat on the trade route between empires, a walled city, wealthy, fortified, and terrified. Rumors had been crawling through the region for 40 years. A slave nation had walked out of Egypt. A sea had split open. Entire kingdoms east of the Jordan had already fallen. Rahab's house was built into the city wall itself, literally part of the fortification. Her profession placed her at the bottom of Jericho's social order. Men used her house. No one respected her in it. Pause here. This detail matters more than it seems. A woman whose body the city consumed was living inside the very wall meant to keep enemies out. The structure built to protect Jericho's pride was held up, in part, by someone Jericho had no pride in protecting. Most retellings treat Rahab's location as incidental. Oh, convenient, she lived on the wall. But think about the irony structurally. The city's defense system depended on the very person it had cast out. That's not a coincidence. It's a quiet indictment of what Jericho valued and what it didn't. The spies slipped into the city and went straight to her house. Not a temple, not a government official, her door. Within hours, the king's men were pounding on it. The king's men demanded she hand the men over. She had seconds to decide. She lied. She hid them on her roof under stalks of flax. Then she sent the soldiers off in the wrong direction. This is where many misunderstand the moment. They focus on the lie and get stuck debating ethics. But the real story is the risk calculation she made in real time. Harboring enemy spies during wartime was a capital offense. She had every reason to turn them in. But she chose to protect them, a choice that risked everything. Rahab chose annihilation-level risk. She wasn't just hiding two strangers. Everything depended on the information she had quietly collected from the streets, the market, and the people around her. The kind of information a king's court would dismiss as beneath them. The woman society ignored had spent years invisibly, absorbed the information that will determine the fate of our city. Power doesn't always sit where you expect it to. Rahab speaks first, and what she says stuns the spies. She tells them she already knows their God dried up the sea. She knows what happened to the kings east of the Jordan. She says, plainly, our hearts melted, and everyone's courage failed because of you. Then she asks for one thing, that when the city falls, her family is spared. Notice what happens here. Before she talks about saving herself, she makes a statement of faith. The order matters. Fear wasn't leading her decisions, faith was. Rahab's story is often retold, but one layer is skipped. Rahab had more accurate theology. Belief first, and the request for safety follows from it. Rahab showed more faith in that moment than most of Jericho's religious establishment. She names Israel's God by his covenant name, something even some Israelites struggled with. At this point in their own story, a woman with no formal religious standing diagnoses the spiritual reality of her entire nation's coming collapse more clearly than the priests inside Jericho's temples. The text is quietly asking, who has spiritual insight? The institution or the outsider paying attention? But this is where everything changes. Because the spies don't just promise to save her, they give her an instruction. And that instruction is the part of this story almost nobody actually sits with. Tie a scarlet cord in your window. When the army comes, every person inside that house, marked by that cord, will live. Everyone outside it will not. She ties the cord, She gathers her father, mother, brothers, and their families into her home, and she waits. This is where many misunderstand the symbolism. It's tempting to read the red cord as just a signal flag, a practical marker. But step back. A scarlet cord, marking a doorway, determining who lives and who dies inside a single household. On the night judgment falls on a city. That pattern shows up elsewhere in the same story tradition, with blood marking doorposts in Egypt so death would pass over. Here's what rarely gets said. Rahab's cord didn't just save her. It required her to decide who else would be saved. She had to gather her family inside her walls. Under her roof, under her risk. The salvation wasn't passive. It demanded that she use her one moment of power to extend protection outward to people who, days earlier, she may have looked down on how she survived. The marginalized woman becomes, for one night, the only person in Jericho with the authority to save anyone at all. 7 days. The Israelite army circles the walls in silence, trumpets in hand, saying nothing. On the 7th day, they circle 7 times. Then the trumpets sound. In the chaos, in the dust, in a city being overrun, one house stands, built into the wall, marked by a scarlet cord, untouched. Pause here. Architecturally and narratively, this is staggering. The wall falls, yet the section holding her house was left standing. The text offers no explanation. It simply states the fact and moves on. Many retellings rush ahead to the rescue. But pause for a moment and picture what the first audience would have imagined. Everything Jericho trusted for security failed completely. Jericho's walls, its army, its gods, all failed. The only stable structure left was tied to the woman the city had least trusted. Security in this story doesn't come from fortification. It comes from being marked by mercy. Rahab and her family are brought out and live among the Israelites. And here the story does something most people never get told. She doesn't disappear into anonymity. Genealogical records list her becoming part of the lineage that eventually produces King David. And centuries later, this same family line appears at the root of Jesus' genealogy in the Gospel of Matthew. This is where many misunderstand the ending. They treat her survival as the climax. It isn't. Her inclusion generations later, named specifically, she stands in a royal and messianic lineage, is the climax. The text is making a deliberate, almost defiant statement about who gets to belong in the story of redemption. Here's the insight almost nobody connects. In a culture obsessed with bloodline purity and respectable ancestry, the official genealogy of Israel's greatest king, the line of kingship in the Bible runs through a Canaanite sex worker from a condemned city, a woman many would reject. But she is the ultimate fulfillment of that promise, not despite that fact, because the text wants you to know it. This isn't a story that tolerates Rahab. It's a story that insists on her. Here's what this story is actually about, underneath the battle and the walls and the cord. It's about what happens when someone with nothing to recommend them, no status, no purity record, no seat at any table, decides to act on the smallest scrap of conviction they have before anyone validates it. Rahab didn't wait to become respectable before she mattered. She acted from exactly where she was standing, with exactly what she knew. And that act became the hinge on which her whole family's future, and a piece of a much larger story, turned. Most people are waiting for permission to matter. Rahab never got it. She just tied the cord. She didn't wait. We tend to think transformation requires starting over, erasing the past, becoming someone new before we're allowed to do something meaningful. Rahab's story argues the opposite. She was never asked to stop being who she'd been. She was asked to act, once, with courage, from inside her actual life. Maybe the walls in your life that feel like they're closing in, waiting for you to become someone else first. Maybe they're just waiting for one decision, made honestly, from exactly where you stand right now. So here's the question worth sitting with. If your one moment came right now, would you wait to feel worthy of it? Or would you already be tying the cord? If this kind of deeper look into these stories is something you want more of, you know where to find it.